She called my inspection holds a bottleneck choking revenue in front of the operations board. I did not argue or move half an inch. I simply wrote down a single line in my notebook that nobody else in the room understood. 31 days later, the exact pipe segments I refused to clear blew up my boss's empire. She thought I was slowing the oil. The truth was, I was the last person keeping the whole system from betraying itself. My name is Lucy Howard. If you looked at the screen at the front of the main conference room at Archer Meridian Pipeline Systems, you would think I was the problem. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, sterile tune overhead, illuminating the crisp lines of Veronica Hale's tailored suit. She stood at the front of the all-hands meeting, a recently hired executive with a background in logistics restructuring and private equity. She had never spent a single night shift listening to the thrum of a booster station, but she wielded a presentation clicker like a loaded weapon. Behind her, a massive slide dominated the wall. It was titled, Cycle Time Delay Analysis. The graph tracked our delivery milestones, and hovering over the most sluggish segment of the chart was a bright, blood-red call-out box. Inside that box, in bold letters, was my name. "What we are looking at here is schedule slippage," Veronica announced. Her voice, amplified by the ceiling microphones, was perfectly modulated and entirely devoid of warmth. She tapped the screen with a red laser pointer. The bright dot danced erratically around my name. "We are operating in a highly competitive market, and we cannot afford a single bottleneck choking our revenue streams. The delays we see in repair releases are simply unacceptable. They are putting millions of dollars in our delivery schedules in jeopardy." I sat in the third row, perfectly still. Around me, the silence in the room grew heavy, thick enough to suffocate. There were over 40 people gathered in this space. The veterans, the ones with sun-weathered necks and calloused hands, who actually walked the right-of-ways and stood in the trenches, stared straight ahead. They did not blink. They knew I did not delay operations for sport. They knew the holds I placed on those pipe segments were the only things that had kept federal regulators from shutting down our entire grid over the past 5 years. They remembered the near misses. They remembered the metal fatigue that almost cost us a river crossing. But the young managers, the fresh financial analysts sitting near the front with their perfectly pressed collars, did not know. A few of them chuckled. It was a nervous, sycophantic sound that echoed off the acoustic panels. They thought they were witnessing a routine corporate power play, a new, dynamic executive marking her territory by putting a stubborn middle manager in her place. They saw it as office politics. They had absolutely no idea it was a matter of federal law. I did not cross my arms defensively. I did not flush with anger or drop my gaze. I did not shift half an inch in my seat. I simply opened my leather-bound notebook, uncapped my heavy steel pen, and wrote down a single, precise line. Consent order. 2018-Independent Integrity Sign-Off required. That order was the absolute baseline of our operational existence. It was a legally binding federal agreement forged after a catastrophe we had barely avoided years prior. It explicitly mandated that a designated, independent authority had to sign off on the structural integrity of every repaired pipe before a single drop of product could be pushed back through the steel. For the past 16 years, I was that authority. It was not a title I clung to for ego or power. It was a reinforced concrete wall built to keep the company from destroying itself and the communities we piped through. Veronica paced across the front of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wood floor. She looked out over the crowd, a captain ready to burn the lifeboats to make the ship sail faster. "The current system is antiquated," she continued, her tone dripping with rehearsed efficiency. "Relying on a single point of failure for critical operational green lights is bad business. We need velocity. Therefore, starting next week, all approvals will be decentralized to accelerate pace. We are empowering our regional teams to make dynamic choices. We are removing the friction." Removing the friction. That was her sterilized, focus group-tested phrasing for removing me. The implication hung in the chilled air of the conference room, loud and clear to anyone paying attention. Veronica was publicly declaring that Lucy Howard was no longer indispensable, but as the corporate buzzwords washed over the rows of chairs, a profound and terrifying realization settled deep into my bones. The sharp sting of public humiliation faded almost instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. This was not a personal attack. This was not a simple insult to my professional pride, and it was certainly not a routine restructuring. Veronica was not just trying to push me out of a leadership role to boost her own authority. She was preparing to dismantle a critical safety mechanism. She was looking at 2,400 miles of steel pipe, operating under immense pressure and carrying highly volatile, hazardous materials, and treating it like a supply chain logic puzzle. She fundamentally believed she could negotiate with physics. She was decentralizing the one operational failsafe that kept compromised steel from rupturing under the crushing weight of her quarterly performance targets. "Thank you all for your time," Veronica concluded, snapping her presentation clicker off with a sharp click. "Let us get back out there and hit those delivery numbers." The overhead lights flared to full brightness, erasing the menacing glow of the projector. The room immediately erupted into the scraping of chairs and the low, urgent murmur of forced, casual conversation. People were eager to pretend they had not just watched an execution. I closed my notebook. The solid snap of the leather cover sounded like a gavel dropping to my own ears, though no one else seemed to notice. I stood up, smoothed the front of my slacks, and walked down the center aisle. The crowd naturally parted for me. Some people looked away, their eyes suddenly fascinated by the notifications on their phones or the gray patterns woven into the carpet. A few of the older field engineers offered tight, grim nods as I passed, silent, heavy acknowledgments of the invisible line that had just been recklessly crossed. I did not stop to chat. I did not seek out the human resources director to file a grievance about public mistreatment. I did not march up to the podium to demand an apology or defend my technical record. I kept my face entirely neutral, maintaining a mask of absolute professional indifference, and pushed my way through the heavy glass doors of the lobby. I stepped out of the air-conditioned building and into the brutal Texas afternoon. The heat hit me like a physical blow, a suffocating blanket of heavy air and blinding, relentless sunlight. The temperature was pushing over 100 degrees, and the heat radiated upward from the black asphalt of the parking lot, warping the air into shimmering, liquid mirages over the hoods of the pickup trucks. It felt heavy and oppressive. It felt like a warning rising straight from the earth itself. I walked to my truck, my heavy work boots crunching faintly against the loose gravel scattered across the pavement. I unlocked the heavy door and climbed inside, immediately gripping the steering wheel. The dark leather was burning hot against my bare palms, but I welcomed the harsh sensation. It was real. It was tangible. It was a stark, aggressive contrast to the sterile, hypothetical world Veronica inhabited up in the executive suites. Up there, in the quiet, temperature-controlled boardroom, pipeline integrity was just a metric on a digital dashboard. A red dot meant a delay, a green dot meant a bonus. But down here, out in the dry scrub brush, the deep trenches, and the muddy river crossings, a pipeline was a pressurized system with no patience for mistakes. It was thousands of miles of cold, hard steel subjected to relentless internal pressure, corrosive soil chemistry, and the invisible, tearing strain of cyclical fatigue. That steel did not care about shareholder value. It did not care about the third-quarter delivery milestones or executive compensation packages. It only cared about the fundamental, unbreakable laws of thermodynamics and material strength. I sat there for a long time, staring through the dusty windshield, watching the heat waves violently distort the shape of the massive corporate headquarters building in the distance. Veronica thought she was fighting a turf war. She thought she was cutting away corporate deadweight to streamline a bureaucratic process. She thought this was a simple, easily managed narrative of a dynamic, forward-thinking boss overcoming an obstinate, old-fashioned employee who refused to get with the times. A deep, icy calm washed over me, chilling the blood in my veins despite the suffocating heat pressing aggressively against the windows of my truck. I understood it perfectly in that quiet, sweltering moment. From that exact second forward, this story would no longer be about a manager disliking a subordinate. It was going to be a devastating, irreversible lesson in reality. It was a matter of who truly understood the violent, unforgiving nature of the product flowing silently beneath the ground, and exactly what happens to an empire when you choose to silence the only person left who is actually listening to the metal. I am 38 years old, born and raised on the flat, wind-scoured plains right outside Amarillo. I did not secure my corner office by managing spreadsheets, attending weekend networking seminars, or kissing the right rings at corporate retreats. I built my career from the dirt up, quite literally. 16 years ago, my very first job in this industry involved hauling a heavy backpack full of cathodic protection testing gear across miles of unforgiving rattlesnake country, conducting manual field corrosion surveys. While the current crop of executives were sitting in air-conditioned university classrooms analyzing hypothetical market trends, I was working the graveyard shift at isolated, floodlit pump stations out in the middle of nowhere. I learned the rhythm of the heavy machinery before I ever learned how to draft a corporate memo. I learned to recognize the deep, thudding vibration of heavy crude moving through 36-inch lines beneath my boots. I spent entire summers standing at the bottom of open excavation pits, baking in 110-degree heat, scraping away cracked epoxy coating and dried Texas clay just to measure the true depth of a pit anomaly with a micrometer. The corporate analysts like to look at the digital readouts from the inline inspection tools, the smart pigs that ran through the pipes, and treat those colorful graphs as absolute gospel. But I was the one who actually climbed down into the trench to match what the algorithm said was down there with the cold, hard reality of the metal itself. That grit, that dirt under my fingernails, and that relentless demand for physical proof eventually earned me the title of Director of Integrity Verification. It was a long, heavy title, but in practice, it meant one very specific, terrifying thing. I was the only person in the entire Archer Meridian corporate structure who held both the internal technical qualifications and the absolute hard-earned trust of the federal regulators at the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to sign my name on the anomaly closure, repair completion, and return to service documents. My signature was the final, unyielding gate between a compromised steel tube and a catastrophic environmental disaster. It was not a position they handed to me out of generosity or a desire for diversity in leadership. They gave it to me because of the Canadian River incident. Years ago, long before the new management team arrived with their slick presentations, a routine data sweep flagged a minor, seemingly insignificant reading near a major water crossing. The automated operational models, the ones the finance department loved because they always minimized downtime, suggested the repair could wait until the next scheduled maintenance window 6 months down the line. I refused to sign off. I drove out to the site and demanded we dig it up immediately. When I finally climbed down into that trench, what I found was a textbook nightmare hiding in plain sight. It was a small, shallow dent, the kind a backhoe might accidentally leave during installation, resting directly on top of a longitudinal seam weld. Worse, it was silently festering with active, aggressive corrosion. A few more pressure cycles, a few more weeks of pushing product at maximum capacity to meet a delivery quota, and that pipe would have split open along the seam. It would have dumped thousands of barrels of toxic crude oil directly into the river basin. After we safely excavated the hazard and replaced the section, I did not just file a report. I locked myself in my office for 3 weeks and entirely redesigned the risk assessment matrix for our entire network. 2,400 miles of steel, every inch of it reevaluated under my new, infinitely stricter parameters. I did not just look at the data, I understood the violent physics behind it. Anyone with a passing grade in business school can read a color-coded operational dashboard. I knew exactly how a tiny deformation in the steel, when combined with the relentless, pulsing stress of cyclic fatigue and a microscopic flaw in a manufacturing weld, could transform from a manageable, low-priority maintenance ticket into a headline-making rupture. I understood that pipelines breathe. They expand and contract with pressure and temperature, and every single breath put strain on the weakest points. Because of this, my professional resume is not filled with the kind of flashy, hyper-inflated metrics designed to go viral on professional networking sites. You will not find bullet points on my profile boasting about increasing quarterly synergy, leveraging dynamic deliverables, or slashing operational friction. My life's work is measured entirely in the dark, quiet space of things that simply did not happen. It is measured in the decades of silent, incident-free operation. It is measured in the dozens of highly uncomfortable meetings where I stood in front of an angry vice president and said the word no, refusing to let them put an unqualified, unproven segment of pipe back into active service just because a major shipper was getting impatient about their cargo. That kind of rigid, uncompromising stubbornness does not make you popular at corporate retreats. I never fit the mold of the polished, modern executive anyway. While my colleagues spent their precious weekends at high-end golf resorts, networking over expensive dinners, or attending wine tastings down in the hill country, I drove my dusty, dented truck back to my family's old ranch. Most Saturdays, you could find me dressed in stained denim, covered in grease and mud, working shoulder to shoulder with my father. We spent our free time wrestling with old, stubborn irrigation lines, patching up rusted galvanized water troughs, and rebuilding the worn-out rubber seals on our heavy diesel water pumps. Working with those brittle, unpredictable agricultural pipes taught me everything I ever really needed to know about fluid dynamics and structural integrity. It instilled a very simple, unbreakable philosophy deep in my core, long before I ever stepped foot in an engineering classroom. If it is under pressure, you test it with the truth. You never test it with belief. My father told me that when I was 12 years old, right after we spent an afternoon watching a poorly patched water line violently explode and flood our lower pasture, ruining a week's worth of feed. He made me dig through the mud to find the shattered joint so I could see exactly where the glue had failed. That lesson applied perfectly to a 2-inch plastic pipe carrying well water across a dirt field, and I learned very quickly that it applied tenfold to a 36-inch high-carbon steel line carrying highly volatile crude oil at 800 pounds per square inch beneath neighborhoods and rivers. You cannot hope a pipe is safe. You cannot assume an anomaly is stable just because a vendor promises it is. You have to dig it up, strip it bare, and look the truth right in the face. Veronica Hale looked at me from behind her pristine conference room podium and saw nothing but a signature that took too long to dry. She saw a stubborn, outdated woman who obstinately refused to adapt to her high-speed, algorithm-driven, cost-cutting vision of the future. She thought I was just a bureaucratic hurdle standing between her and a massive end-of-year bonus. She did not understand that I was not just a middle manager holding a rubber stamp. I was the living, breathing, operational memory of the entire pipeline system. I knew exactly where all the bodies were buried. I knew exactly where the steel was weak, which seams were prone to cracking, and exactly what the metal could and could not endure under the stress of a brutal winter or a scorching summer. She thought she was simply clearing a bottleneck to make the numbers look better for the board of directors. She had absolutely no idea she was systematically removing the only person in the building who still knew how to read the physical warning signs before the ground split open. Veronica Hale was brought in under the glittering or aggressive banner of being the exact person hired to increase throughput. Before descending upon our corporate headquarters, her entire career had been spent comfortably insulated within the sterile, high-altitude environments of logistics restructuring and private equity firms. She possessed a formidable resume built entirely out of abstract financial victories and corporate streamlining. She had never worn a set of fire-retardant coveralls. She had never stepped foot on a muddy right-of-way during a freezing thunderstorm, and she certainly had never spent a graveyard shift listening to the screaming whine of a mainline pump station fighting against a sudden pressure drop. Yet, she arrived carrying an absolute, terrifying certainty. It was a specific brand of executive confidence completely divorced from physical reality. In her introductory meetings, she spoke fluently in a modern dialect of corporate optimization. She bombarded the boardroom with terms like velocity, operational friction, and dashboard accountability. She painted a vivid picture of a pipeline network that functioned like a perfectly frictionless digital supply chain, where product moved from point A to point B without a single drop of hesitation. The polished facade cracked. However, the very first time she stepped out of her executive suite to address the veteran operational leadership team, a senior field supervisor, a man who had spent 30 years watching steel age and bend in the ground, raised his hand and asked a highly specific question. He wanted to know how her proposed accelerated timelines would account for the unique cyclic fatigue inherent in our older, low-frequency electrical resistance welded seam types. Veronica completely froze. For a fraction of a second, the commanding executive vanished, replaced by someone completely and utterly out of her depth. She blinked rapidly, recovered her sharp plastic smile, and pivoted flawlessly back to her rehearsed script. We are going to leverage our advanced analytics software to synthesize those legacy concerns into our overall friction reduction strategy, she answered smoothly. It was a perfectly constructed string of words that meant absolutely nothing. The field supervisor slowly lowered his hand, his weathered face hardening into a look of quiet, profound dread. He knew it immediately, and I knew it too. We were now being led by someone who did not know the difference between a minor spreadsheet error and a catastrophic mechanical failure. To bridge the massive, glaring gap between her financial goals and our physical operations, Veronica created a brand new department on the top floor. She called it the Flow Acceleration Office. It was populated entirely by freshly graduated business analysts and data scientists recruited from top-tier universities. They were incredibly proficient at building complex Excel models and generating stunning visual presentations. They were also entirely useless in the field. To the young analysts in the Flow Acceleration Office, a pipeline was not a massive, volatile industrial asset carrying hazardous material beneath communities. It was just a series of rows and columns on a monitor. A suspected crack in a longitudinal weld was not a physical threat. It was merely a stubborn data point that negatively impacted their monthly flow efficiency metrics. Veronica quickly became obsessed with their digital dashboards. Specifically, she harbored a deep, visceral hatred for the red dots that populated the screen whenever an anomaly required physical excavation and technical verification. To her, those red dots were not critical safety warnings. They were ugly, glowing indictments of her failure to maximize the volume of crude oil we were pushing out to the coastal refineries. She openly despised the fact that a complex algorithm could flag a potential issue, but we still had to spend tens of thousands of dollars and weeks of time sending a heavy equipment crew out to dig a massive hole in the dirt just to check it. During our weekly integrity review meetings, the fundamental disconnect between her theoretical world and my physical reality became a recurring, exhausting battle. Whenever a segment of pipe was placed on a mandatory safety hold, Veronica would lean forward, tap her expensive pen against the mahogany table, and ask the exact same question. Why have we not released this segment? She never asked if we were certain the pipe was safe. She never asked what the structural risks were. She only asked why the product was not moving. Because the inline inspection tool flagged a 50% wall loss anomaly located at the 6 o'clock position on the pipe. I would explain, keeping my voice carefully level and strictly professional. We need to excavate the site to verify the reading before we can even consider restoring the pressure. But the predictive algorithm suggests an 80% probability that the tool is simply misinterpreting a harmless manufacturing mill defect, Veronica would counter, gesturing impatiently toward one of her analysts from the Flow Acceleration Office. The dashboard shows it as a low-priority risk. We are wasting precious cycle time chasing ghosts. I would look at the young analyst, who was nervously adjusting his glasses, then back to Veronica, feeling the familiar, heavy exhaustion settling deep in my chest. I tried, repeatedly, to make her understand the basic, unforgiving physics of our industry. I explained that the smart pig data sent back by the inline inspection tools was just a preliminary signal. It was a digital metal detector waving blindly over the ground, not a high-definition photograph of the actual steel. A predictive algorithm cannot hold back 800 pounds per square inch of operating pressure. I told her directly during one particularly tense, unyielding exchange. If you want to return this line to full service, we have to physically verify the signal. We have to dig the trench, sandblast the thick epoxy coating off the steel, measure the true remaining wall thickness with ultrasonic calipers, photograph the exact orientation of the corrosion, and calculate the surrounding soil load. You simply cannot clear a structural anomaly with an educated guess made from an office chair. Veronica would listen with half an ear, her eyes already drifting back to the offending red dots on her screen. She would sigh, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed loudly in the quiet conference room. "You are being far too conservative. Lucy," she would say, dismissing my 16 years of field experience with a casual wave of her manicured hand. "We cannot afford to let legacy paranoia dictate our modern business rhythm. You need to find a way to get comfortable with an acceptable margin of risk." With that single repeated phrase, she began a very deliberate, systematic reframing of my role within the company hierarchy. I was no longer the final line of defense protecting the company from environmental devastation and federal prosecution. I was being aggressively painted as an obstructionist. I was a stubborn middle manager clinging to outdated principles, actively turning routine safety protocols into a frustrating business obstacle. I knew I could not appeal over her head to the executive board. Chief Executive Officer Owen Mercer was standing firmly behind her every move. The company was currently drowning under the immense weight of aggressive expansion loans. Our major creditors were demanding better returns immediately, and the massive shipping conglomerates were threatening to take their oil contracts to rival networks if we could not guarantee faster delivery times. Owen Mercer did not care about cyclic fatigue or compromised seam types either. He only cared about surviving the next quarterly earnings call. In his desperate eyes, the crushing pressure from the banks meant that anything Veronica did to make the oil move faster was an absolute act of corporate salvation. But the true, terrifying nature of Veronica's unearned confidence did not fully crystallize for me until late one Thursday evening. I was reviewing a newly published executive compensation document that had been accidentally uploaded to the general company server without the proper password protection. I scrolled down through the complex legal jargon to the section detailing the performance incentives for the new operations leadership tier. There, spelled out in plain, undeniable black and white text, was the final, chilling piece of the puzzle. Veronica Hale's massive, 7-figure end-of-year bonus was not tied to zero-incident safety records. It was not tied to environmental compliance or successful federal audits. Her primary bonus multiplier was directly mathematically tied to reducing the total number of days pipe segments spent on integrity release holds. I sat completely alone in my dim office, staring blankly at the glowing monitor. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin and suffocating. She was not just pushing back against my safety protocols out of sheer ignorance or a misguided belief in her shiny digital dashboards. The company had literally given her a massive financial incentive to view safety as a costly nuisance. Every single day, I kept a suspected crack in the ground from returning to full operational pressure. I was taking money directly out of her pocket. She had a vested, highly lucrative reason to absolutely despise my caution. She was being paid a premium to ignore the truth buried in the dirt. The slow burn of a disaster rarely begins with a sudden, deafening crack of tearing steel. It almost always starts with a quiet, seemingly harmless administrative shortcut. It creeps in through the digital backdoor of a company system, disguised as a minor procedural update. I could feel the invisible weight of the impending wreck building in the air. A slow accumulation of pressure that had absolutely nothing to do with the oil in our lines and everything to do with the people sitting in the executive suites. It began on a late Tuesday evening. My desk phone rang just after 7 o'clock. It was Grant Hollis, one of our most seasoned field managers out in the Permian Basin. He did not call my company cell phone, and he did not send an email. He called my direct landline from inside a noisy compressor station, letting the heavy, rhythmic thrumming of the machinery mask the background. "She is asking around," Grant told me, his voice low, tight, and stripped of any casual pleasantries. Hale had a private conference call with the regional directors this morning. She wanted to know what the legal framework looked like to decouple the integrity approval process from one single individual. She did not use your name, but she did not have to. She is actively looking for a bypass. I thanked him, my voice perfectly steady, and placed the receiver back on the cradle. The warning was chilling precisely because it was so coldly logical. They could not argue with the physics of a compromised pipe, so they were simply going to rewrite the rules of who was allowed to look at it. The very next morning, that abstract threat materialized into a digital reality. I was running my routine weekly audit on our Central Integrity Management portal, cross-referencing the latest raw data dumps with our active maintenance queues. I scrolled down to a specific line item, a known anomaly on a 30-inch line running through a highly populated suburban corridor. For 3 weeks, that specific defect had been clearly coded in red with a strict, mandatory directive excavate now. I blinked at the screen. The red highlight was gone. The status code had been silently changed from a mandatory immediate excavation to a low-priority green tag that read, "Monitor next cycle." I checked the digital audit trail. The alteration had not been made by a field engineer or a certified metallurgist. It had been executed just past midnight by a 24-year-old junior analyst sitting in the newly formed flow acceleration office. There were absolutely no new technical reports attached to the file. There were no updated ultrasonic readings, no revised stress calculations, and no field photographs. Someone had simply logged into the database and decided that a highly dangerous structural weakness no longer existed because it was administratively inconvenient. A cold spike of adrenaline hit my chest. It was a digital sleight of hand that could easily level a neighborhood. I immediately reverted the code back to its critical red status. I locked the entry and typed a detailed, uncompromising technical note into the permanent log, explicitly citing the federal safety codes that mandated the dig. I knew exactly what was happening. They were testing the fences. They were probing the perimeter of my authority, watching closely to see if I was paying attention, trying to determine exactly how far the system would bend before my oversight caught them. 2 days later, the sabotage moved from the digital realm out into the physical dirt. I received an automated notification that a scheduled excavation crew in New Mexico had been ordered to stand down. They were already mobilized, their heavy earth-moving equipment parked less than a mile from a highly sensitive dig site located dangerously close to a major river crossing. I pulled up the work order. The suspension reason was not weather, and it was not equipment failure. It was listed simply as quarterly budget reprioritization. Stopping a mobilized crew cost the company thousands of dollars in wasted contractor fees, but it magically kept the massive expense of the actual repair off the books for the current financial quarter. They were perfectly willing to leave a critical, unverified threat sitting right next to a flowing river just to make the current 3-month financial spreadsheet look slightly more attractive to the shareholders. The suffocating restriction of information quickly became official policy. By the end of the month, Veronica issued a company-wide directive fundamentally altering how field data was reported to the executive tier. She declared that the standard, comprehensive field reports, the dense files containing dozens of pages of raw data, soil chemistry analysis, and high-resolution photographs, were no longer acceptable. "I want a single-page summary for every pending integrity hold," Veronica announced during a small, tense strategy meeting. She tapped her manicured fingers sharply against the polished wood table. "Bullet points only. I do not have the time or the bandwidth to sift through 50 pages of technical noise just to get to a basic yes or no answer." I sat across from her, keeping my posture relaxed but my gaze entirely fixed on hers. I chose my words with deliberate, quiet precision. "The noise you are referring to is the exact evidence required to prevent a catastrophic rupture," I explained softly. "You cannot summarize a complex stress corrosion cracking colony into 3 bullet points on a single page. The details are not decorative. The details are the only things keeping the product inside the pipe." She simply rolled her eyes, a fleeting expression of profound irritation, and looked past me to her financial director. She did not want to understand the details. She wanted an administrative fiction she could easily digest and quickly dismiss. That evening, sitting alone on my porch as the Texas sky bruised into a deep, dark purple, I made a phone call to Nora Bell. Nora was a retired enforcement advisor for the Federal Regulatory Agency. She was a woman who had spent 40 years investigating the charred, ruined aftermath of pipeline explosions caused by exactly this kind of corporate arrogance. I did not give her confidential company data, but I sketched out the rigid, inescapable shape of the bureaucratic walls closing in around me. Nora listened in complete silence for 5 minutes. When I finished, she let out a long, raspy exhale. "They are building a paper trail to work around you," Nora said, her voice dry and sharp like cracking dry wood. "They do not want your knowledge. They just want your ability to say no to disappear. Listen to me very carefully. Do your job exactly to the letter of the law. Do not touch a single document, system, or decision that falls outside your strict designated purview. Document every single time they override your protocols. And most importantly, do not try to save people who are actively fighting to do the wrong thing." I ended the call and stared out into the dark horizon. Nora was entirely right. I finally understood the terrifying truth of the situation. Archer Meridian did not actually care about increasing speed or streamlining operations. What they truly desired was a silent, unrecorded bypass around the heavy iron shield of technical reality that I represented. As the final weeks of the financial quarter approached, the internal pressure inside the corporate headquarters became a physical, crushing force. The delivery demands from the major coastal shippers grew increasingly aggressive. Every delayed barrel of crude oil was a missed revenue target, and the tension in the hallways was thick enough to taste. Every time I walked into the break room, every time I stepped into an elevator, I could feel the hostile, desperate eyes of the management team boring into my back. In their minds, I was no longer an engineer protecting the public and their own physical assets. I had been successfully transformed into the singular, stubborn reason their profit margins were not beautiful. They looked at me as if I was deliberately stealing their bonuses. The environment had shifted from merely toxic to profoundly dangerous, and every logical step they took to silence me was marching the entire company one step closer to the edge of an unimaginable cliff. The summons came at exactly 2:00 on a Tuesday afternoon. The calendar invite had no subject line, no attached agenda, and no preliminary details. It only listed a location. It was the glass-walled conference room on the second floor, a sterile, highly visible space almost exclusively reserved for corporate executions. I walked through the heavy door and found exactly what I expected. A representative from Human Resources sat rigidly on the far side of the polished mahogany table, his hands folded neatly over a blank legal pad. Veronica Hale stood near the large window, her back mostly turned to the room. She was clutching a thick manila folder. I could clearly see the label printed on the tab. It contained a single, highly sanitized word: restructuring. She did not look at me as I pulled out a heavy leather chair and sat down. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the highway traffic crawling sluggishly in the far distance. "Lucy," Veronica began, her voice entirely stripped of its usual aggressive corporate pitch. It was replaced by a flat, heavily rehearsed monotone. "As you are aware, Archer Meridian is currently undergoing a comprehensive strategic realignment to better position ourselves for the demands of the upcoming fiscal year." I did not nod. I did not blink. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the cold surface of the table, and waited for the axe to fall. She finally turned to face the room, though her eyes carefully avoided mine, focusing instead on a blank spot on the wall just above my right shoulder. "After a careful, data-driven evaluation of our internal workflows," Veronica continued, speaking with the mechanical cadence of someone reading directly from a legal script, "we have determined that the current integrity review program is far too heavily concentrated. In order to increase our operational velocity and modernize our overall approach, we are shifting the entire department to a team-based approval model. This new operational framework will be heavily supported by artificial intelligence analytics and a newly retained firm of external consultants. The human resources representative slid a thick stack of heavily stapled documents across the table toward me. Consequently, Veronica concluded, finally forcing her eyes to meet mine for a fraction of a second, your current position is being eliminated, effective immediately. We appreciate your past contributions to the company, and Human Resources will walk you through the details of your severance package. I looked down at the paperwork resting under my fingertips. They were fundamentally eliminating the only fully qualified set of eyes in the entire building. They were replacing a certified engineering process with a newly formed committee, a predictive algorithm, and a group of hired outside contractors who possessed absolutely no legal authority to sign federal compliance documents. It was breathtakingly reckless. It was a perfectly crafted recipe for an inevitable disaster. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue about the terrifying safety implications, nor did I waste my breath defending my flawless 16-year track record. I knew with absolute certainty that the decision was already in ink, mandated by executives who only understood profit margins. I looked up from the termination papers, locked my eyes directly onto Veronica, and asked a single, highly specific question. Who is the designated integrity authority under the 2018 consent agreement, and has the operator qualification matrix been updated to reflect this immediate change? The question hit the air and froze the room completely solid. The human resources representative blinked rapidly, his brow furrowing as he frantically searched his corporate vocabulary for terms he fundamentally did not comprehend. He looked at Veronica for a translation. Veronica stiffened. The polished, unshakable executive armor cracked just a fraction of an inch. Her jaw tightened, and a sudden, sharp flicker of genuine uncertainty passed through her eyes. She recognized the terms because she had heard me use them in countless contentious meetings, but she had absolutely no idea how heavy those specific words actually were. She did not realize that the qualification matrix was not a simple internal company policy. It was a strict federal mandate dictating exactly who was legally allowed to declare a pipeline safe to operate under pressure. The silence stretched out for 4 long, agonizing seconds. Our legal department will handle all the necessary regulatory paperwork, Veronica finally snapped, her voice carrying a highly defensive, slightly panicked edge. That is no longer your concern. That single sentence told me everything I needed to know. They had entirely bypassed the legal and technical compliance framework just to get me out of the building faster. They had reached their hands directly into a highly complex, heavily regulated machine and ripped out a critical safety gear without having the faintest idea what that gear actually controlled. I picked up the black pen provided by the human resources representative. I carefully read through the top sheet of the packet. It was a standard, boilerplate acknowledgement of termination and a receipt confirming the severance details. I signed my name strictly to that specific page. Then, I flipped to the second section, which contained vaguely worded legal clauses about smoothly transitioning my technical duties to the new team-based committee. I placed the pen down on the table. I am acknowledging receipt of my termination notice, I stated calmly, pushing the thick stack back across the mahogany surface. I will not sign any document that implies I endorse, approve, or transition my technical authority to an unqualified committee or an external vendor. If you want to operate this network without a federally designated authority, that is a choice you are making completely on your own. The human resources representative opened his mouth to object, but I was already standing up. I walked out of the glass room, leaving them sitting in the suffocating, heavy silence they had just purchased for themselves. I went straight to my office. I did not pack any company files, structural binders, or digital hard drives. I did not want a single shred of Archer Meridian property on my person. I opened my bottom desk drawer and removed exactly 3 items that belonged exclusively to me. First, I took out my heavy brass professional engineering stamp, the physical seal of my technical credibility. Second, I picked up my worn leather wallet containing my state and federal certification cards. Finally, I reached for a small, faded photograph framed in cheap plastic. It was a picture of my family ranch, taken by my father right after a heavy spring rainstorm had flooded our lower pasture. Everything else, the years of detailed field notes, the heavy reference books, the personalized coffee mugs, I left exactly where it was. I walked down the main corridor, rode the elevator down to the lobby, and pushed through the heavy front doors into the sweltering Texas afternoon heat. I did not look back at the building. When I reached my truck parked in the far corner of the asphalt lot, I climbed inside, started the heavy engine, and immediately dialed Nora Bell. The air conditioning blasted aggressively against my face as the phone rang over the speakers. Nora picked up on the third ring. I gave her a completely factual, entirely emotionless summary of the 10-minute meeting in the glass room. I repeated Veronica's exact words regarding the team-based approvals and her blind assumption that the legal department would simply handle the paperwork. Nora let out a low, dry chuckle that sounded exactly like heavy tires crunching over loose gravel. She did not express a single ounce of sympathy. She did not tell me to hire a vicious employment lawyer or plan a massive, retaliatory lawsuit against the board of directors. "They just handed you a masterclass in self-destruction," Nora said, her voice sharp and absolutely uncompromising. "Listen to me very carefully. Lucy, do not send a single forwarding email. Do not attempt to log into the company network from your phone to check on anything. Do not answer questions from their legal department when they inevitably realize what they have actually done. Do not help them fill the massive hole they just dug for themselves. You are out. Stay completely out." "I will," I replied, shifting the heavy truck into drive. "Good," Nora said. "Let the metal do the talking now." I ended the call and drove away from the corporate campus. The heavy traffic on the interstate felt completely detached from my new reality. I did not go back to my apartment in the city. I pointed the nose of my truck straight toward the panhandle, driving for hours until the dense concrete skyline completely dissolved into the flat, empty expanse of the high plains. I arrived at my family ranch just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, deeply bruised shadows across the dry dirt. My father was out by the main agricultural water tank, wrestling with a massive iron pipe wrench. Water was violently spraying from a cracked brass valve, heavily soaking his denim shirt. I did not say a single word about the glass room, the termination papers, or the corporate severance package. I simply walked over to the bed of my truck, grabbed my own heavy wrench, and stepped directly into the mud beside him. For 45 minutes, we worked in complete, comfortable silence. We shut off the main pressure line, stripped the broken valve off the rusted threads, cleaned the heavy iron joints, applied fresh industrial sealant, and torqued a brand new valve perfectly into place. When we finally turned the main pressure back on, the line held firm. Not a single drop of water leaked from the newly joined seam. It was repaired correctly. It was repaired with absolute physical proof. Later that evening, we sat at the worn wooden table in the kitchen, eating a quiet dinner while the crickets chirped loudly outside the screen door. The old house was calm, deeply grounded, and entirely real. I looked down at my hands, noticing my knuckles were slightly bruised and stained with fresh pipe sealant. My father took a slow sip of his black coffee, set the ceramic mug down, and looked at me steadily from across the table. He could easily read the subtle shift in my posture, the quiet, heavy intensity radiating from my silence. "Did something happen in the city today?" he asked softly. I met his gaze, feeling the absolute, undeniable certainty settling deep in my chest. "Yes," I said, my voice perfectly steady and entirely devoid of any regret. "They just fired the wrong person." I did not pick up my phone to call the Federal Regulatory Tip Line. I did not draft a vindictive, whistleblowing email to our largest coastal shipping clients to warn them about the catastrophic risk they were suddenly underwriting. I did not attempt to access any digital backdoors to sabotage the operational network. I simply let the long, heavy silence ring out across the high plains. I knew the federal oversight machine intimately. It is an incredibly slow, plodding beast, but it is also absolutely devoid of a sense of humor. The mandatory periodic inspection framework was designed by the government specifically to catch this exact brand of unchecked corporate arrogance. If the executive board at Archer Meridian truly intended to leave my designated regulatory role completely vacant, the upcoming federal audit would find the gaping, bleeding hole entirely on its own. I did not need to light a single match. I just needed to step back, sit on my porch, and watch them carelessly pour the gasoline over their own feet. For 31 days, my universe shrank down to the quiet, predictable, and deeply comforting rhythm of the Texas Panhandle. I traded the high-stakes, suffocating pressure of structural integrity, risk matrices, for the highly tangible simplicity of agricultural administration. I spent my early morning sitting across from my father at the worn wooden kitchen table, drinking bitter black coffee and helping him draft newly updated grazing lease contracts for the lower pasture. I spent my long afternoons meticulously recalculating my monthly mortgage payments and adjusting my personal budget to account for the sudden, jarring loss of my corporate salary. In the quiet, deeply bruised evenings, listening to the dry wind howl relentlessly across the dirt, I seriously considered walking away from the oil and gas industry entirely. The sheer exhaustion of fighting tailored suits in air-conditioned glass rooms had seeped so deep into my bones I felt like my skeleton was made of lead. The energy sector, however, is essentially a small rural town masquerading as a massive global enterprise. Word of my sudden, unexplained departure traveled incredibly fast through the invisible network of field operators and executive recruiters. Exactly 2 weeks into my forced exile, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the kitchen counter. It was Mara Keene. She was the chief executive officer of High Plains Transit, our largest, smartest, and most direct regional competitor. Mara had spent the better part of 2 years actively trying to poach me away from Archer Meridian. She was a brilliant, sharp-elbowed operator who actually understood the fundamental physics of the metal in the ground. I heard the boardroom up in Dallas finally lost their absolute minds, Mara said the moment I answered, skipping the pleasantries entirely. I have a vacant vice president chair, an open checkbook, and a mandate to build the right kind of integrity assurance department in this state. Name your price, Lucy. It was a massive lifeline, but I hesitated. I told her I needed a few more weeks to process the fallout. My hesitation was certainly not born out of any lingering loyalty to the executive board that had just fired me. It was the heavy, suffocating guilt keeping me awake at night. I kept thinking about the seasoned field crews, the hardworking men and women still out there standing in the muddy trenches, blindly trusting a safety verification system that had just been quietly and ruthlessly dismantled from the top down. While I was out under the sun fixing broken barbed wire fence lines, Veronica Hale was busy inside the climate-controlled headquarters accelerating the collapse of her own empire. Information still managed to trickle back to me through encrypted text messages from a few trusted veteran operators who were watching the chaos unfold. Veronica had officially launched an aggressive internal campaign she proudly branded the Red Dot Reduction Sprint. Her singular, frantic objective was to completely wipe the executive operational dashboard clean of any pending maintenance holds before the financial quarter officially closed out. She quickly turned the newly formed Flow Acceleration Office into a digital sweatshop. The junior analysts, terrified of missing her arbitrary, high-velocity deadlines, were being aggressively pressured into mass-closing critical safety files. They were rubber-stamping repair completions based entirely on single-page, heavily sanitized data summaries. They were approving critical return to service orders completely devoid of the legally required physical evidence. There were no high-resolution excavation photographs showing the bare steel. There were no manual micrometer depth verifications proving the corrosion had been properly assessed. There were absolutely no field orientation comparisons to confirm the SmartPig algorithmic data actually matched the physical reality of the pipe wall. The internal breaking point inside the corporate building came when a senior external contract engineer, a man hired specifically to provide the illusion of oversight, finally looked closely at the terrifying mountain of approved paperwork. He walked directly into Veronica's pristine office, holding a thick stack of closure packages that fundamentally lacked the physical proof required to safely restore the pipeline pressure. He nervously but firmly pointed out the glaringly obvious missing field verifications. Veronica did not even bother to look up from her glowing monitor. She delivered a directive so profoundly reckless, so casually destructive, it would later echo through every single federal regulatory hearing room in the state. Clear the red dots. Legal can narrate the paperwork later. I was hundreds of miles away, sitting on a wooden porch watching the dust blow, and I did not hear her speak those exact words out loud. But my 16 years of honed professional intuition made my stomach turn completely to ice. I knew the exact, predictable trajectory of corporate desperation. I understood instantly that they were no longer simply bypassing my authority to save time. They were now actively, intentionally rewriting physical reality. They were pretending the high-carbon steel was safe just because a junior analyst clicked a button on a spreadsheet. I made a firm, unbreakable decision right then and there. I would only accept another phone call from the industry when I was absolutely certain I had bled out the very last drop of my misplaced, blind loyalty to Archer Meridian. I owed them absolutely nothing. The ticking explosive device they had wound up was entirely of their own making. What Veronica Hale, her compliant human resources department, and her entire team of young financial analysts had completely failed to realize in their frantic, bonus-driven rush to clear the digital dashboard was a single, immovable administrative fact. A routine, highly comprehensive periodic regulatory audit by the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration had already been locked onto the official federal calendar a full 3 months before they ever handed me my termination papers. It was a massive, uncompromising inspection designed to tear through the exact files they were currently faking. And there was not a single beautifully designed, color-coded executive presentation in the entire corporate world that could make those federal inspectors magically disappear. Exactly 31 days after I left that glass conference room behind, the heavy, unforgiving machinery of the federal government ground into motion. The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration officially initiated their scheduled compliance audit under the strict parameters of the 2018 Consent Agreement. They did not begin the process with a polite introductory email or a friendly phone call to the executive suites. They struck with the administrative equivalent of a sledgehammer. A massive, legally binding demand for documentation was uploaded directly into the Central Compliance Portal at Archer Meridian. The regulators mandated the immediate submission of the complete, unredacted closure files for exactly 47 specific pipeline anomalies. Every single one of these flagged locations was situated in what the government explicitly classifies as high-consequence areas. These were not isolated pipes buried out in the barren, empty desert. These were massive steel lines running directly beneath municipal drinking water aquifers, cutting through densely populated suburban neighborhoods, and crossing highly sensitive ecological riverways. The federal inspectors began their audit by verifying the fundamental administrative baseline of the company, and their very first check exposed a catastrophic structural void. They pulled the designated operator qualification matrix to confirm exactly who possessed the legal authority to declare the pipeline network safe for pressurized operation. My name had been completely scrubbed from the active roster. However, the space where a federally approved, rigorously tested successor should have been listed was entirely blank. Veronica Hale had successfully executed her vision to decentralize the approval process, but she had fundamentally failed to understand that the federal regulatory framework does not recognize corporate synergy or team-based decision-making. The government requires a single, highly qualified human being to take absolute, personal legal liability for the structural integrity of the steel. Archer Meridian was actively pushing millions of barrels of highly volatile crude oil through the ground without a single authorized engineer at the helm. The situation rapidly deteriorated from a severe administrative violation into a full-blown regulatory nightmare when the inspectors began opening the actual anomaly closure files submitted by the newly formed Flow Acceleration Office. The documentation provided was a masterclass in profound bureaucratic negligence. The official repair complete packages were signed and stamped by junior data analysts who possessed absolutely no metallurgical credentials or field engineering certifications. The files themselves were breathtakingly hollow. They lacked the most basic, mandatory physical evidence required by federal law. There were no high-resolution photographs of the bare steel in the trenches. There were no manual micrometer depth verification reports. There were no raw data logs comparing the physical pipe wall condition after excavation against the initial automated tool runs. The auditors were staring at a massive stack of paperwork that boldly declared the infrastructure was perfectly safe simply because someone sitting in a Dallas office chair had typed the word complete into a digital spreadsheet based on a predictive algorithm. As the auditors dug deeper into the falsified records, the pace of the investigation shifted gears from a routine procedural review into a state of absolute emergency intervention. Two specific locations immediately triggered massive alarm bells within the federal agency. The first was a highly volatile cluster of complex corrosion anomalies situated dangerously close to a major commercial river crossing in Texas. The second was a long, notoriously fragile segment of old electrical resistance welded seam pipe running straight through a populated zone in central Oklahoma. These were the exact same critical high-risk locations I had aggressively held back from repressurization during my final weeks at the company. I had explicitly demanded full physical excavations and structural reinforcements. Veronica's new analytical team had simply cleared the red warning dots off their executive dashboard and ramped the operational pressure back up to maximum capacity, based entirely on an automated summary report. The federal agency did not even wait to finish reviewing the rest of the requested paperwork. They immediately issued an emergency supplemental information request, demanding physical, undeniable proof of safety within 48 hours. The administrative shockwave generated by this demand was so massive, it immediately bled over into local jurisdictions. State environmental and energy regulatory commissions began closely tracking the federal audit. The state agencies instantly recognized the terrifying operational signature of a massive pipeline network running on entirely empty paperwork. The regulatory walls were suddenly closing in on Archer Meridian at the speed of a runaway freight train. That is exactly when my personal cell phone began to ring. It started early on a Thursday morning. The caller identification displayed the main legal department at Archer Meridian. I let the phone vibrate against the kitchen counter until the screen went dark. 10 minutes later, the chief operating officer called. Then the head of human resources tried. By noon, even the main corporate switchboard number was flashing relentlessly on my screen. They were hopelessly trapped inside a burning building of their own making, and they had suddenly realized I was the only person on Earth who possessed the technical combination to the exit door. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I finally swiped the screen to answer. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply held the phone to my ear and breathed into the receiver. "Lucy, thank God you picked up." A frantic, breathy voice blurted out. It was the lead corporate counsel. The arrogant, untouchable tone he usually wielded in the executive boardroom was completely gone, entirely replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. "We are facing a slight misunderstanding with the federal auditors regarding the recent anomaly closure packages. We urgently need you to come back on board as an independent consultant. We are prepared to offer you 3 times your previous salary, plus a massive signing bonus. We just need you to help us complete the historical paperwork and verify the continuity of the integrity program." I listened to the desperate plea, feeling the dry wind brush against my face. He was not asking me for technical advice. He was aggressively begging me to retroactively legalize a massive, systemic fraud. They wanted me to use my hard-earned engineering stamp to officially endorse pipeline segments I had never physically inspected. They were asking me to become legally complicit in their reckless gamble. I knew with absolute certainty that if I signed even a single one of those empty closure packages, the inevitable federal criminal charges would drag my entire career, my technical reputation, and my personal freedom straight down into the dirt right alongside them. "I am not your consultant," I stated. My voice was completely flat, sharp as a razor, and entirely devoid of any sympathy. "I cannot verify field work I never witnessed, and I will absolutely not backdate federal safety documents to cover up your negligence. You fired the only designated authority you had in the building. Now you have to explain to the federal government why you turned the pressure back on without one. Do not call this number again." I ended the call and stood in the quiet afternoon heat. The heavy tension that had been coiled tight in my chest for an entire month finally snapped, releasing a massive wave of pure, absolute clarity. I immediately opened my contact list, dialed Mara Keene at High Plains Transit, and listened to the steady ring. "Tell me you are finally ready to get back to work," Mara said the second she picked up the line. "I am officially accepting the position of Vice President of Integrity Assurance," I told her, my voice ringing with a sharp, undeniable energy. "Draft the employment contract." By accepting that specific role on that exact day, I cemented the final nail into my former employer's coffin. When the industry wire inevitably caught wind of my corporate move, Archer Meridian would instantly realize they had not just lost a stubborn, uncooperative employee. They had permanently lost the absolute easiest, most credible lifeline they could have ever used to save themselves from the impending regulatory slaughter. Archer Meridian did exactly what a massive, terrified corporate entity always does when backed into a lethal regulatory corner. They attempted to buy their way out of physical reality. In a state of absolute blind panic, the executive board wired an emergency retainer of $3 million to a towering, ruthless engineering and compliance consulting firm based out of Chicago. A team of highly paid, sharp-suited crisis managers and forensic engineers was immediately flown down to Dallas on a chartered private jet. Their mandate was simple: fix the paperwork, satisfy the federal auditors, and get the crude oil flowing again at maximum capacity. The strategy was incredibly expensive, and it lasted exactly 48 hours. The out-of-state consultants marched into the flow acceleration office, commandeered the digital servers, and began pulling the closure files. They quickly hit a massive, unforgiving brick wall. They discovered that they could not simply stamp a document to confirm a pipeline was safe if the initial, fundamental chain of physical evidence had been deliberately broken. You cannot verify the depth of a corrosion pit from a photograph that was never taken. You cannot calculate the remaining tensile strength of a steel seam without the raw ultrasonic measurements from the excavation site. The lead consultant, a veteran engineer who valued his own federal license far more than Archer Meridian's retainer fee, walked directly into the executive boardroom. He dropped the hollow files onto the mahogany table and informed the chief executive officer that no sane engineer would ever sign their name to a fabricated reality. As the expensive consulting strategy spectacularly collapsed, the internal foundation of the company began to violently fracture. A junior systems administrator, terrified of being implicated in a federal investigation, anonymously leaked a highly damaging internal communication to the legal department. It was a direct email from Veronica Hale to her team of young analysts, sent just days before the end of the previous financial quarter. The email contained a single, devastating sentence: "Do not let a single red dot live into the next quarter." That single string of words instantly mutated the entire crisis. The federal auditors were no longer looking at a case of profound professional ignorance or sloppy administrative oversight. The leaked email provided hard, undeniable documentary evidence of systemic, intentional regulatory evasion. Veronica had explicitly ordered her team to bypass federal safety laws just to make her digital performance dashboard look clean. The crisis compounded when the board of directors finally looked past her polished presentations and examined the specific structure of her executive compensation package. The boardroom was entirely shocked to discover that Veronica's massive, 7-figure year-end bonus was mathematically chained directly to the reduction of integrity hold times. The company had unknowingly constructed a lethal financial incentive. They had literally promised to pay her millions of dollars to view critical public safety measures as annoying financial obstacles. The consequences of this manufactured reality quickly spilled out of the corporate headquarters and slammed directly into the physical supply chain. Because the federal agency had placed strict operational limits on the compromised pipeline segments, The massive storage terminals down on the Gulf Coast began filling up with unshipped cargo. Millions of barrels of heavy crude oil sat idle in massive steel tanks, slowly baking in the southern sun. The commercial trading desks in Dallas were suddenly drowning in relentless, furious phone calls from major international shippers demanding to know why their incredibly lucrative cargo was not moving. For the very first time in the history of the company, the aggressive, profit-driven commercial department finally understood that the regulatory compliance team was not an annoying roadblock designed to kill their deals. They realized that strict compliance was the only thing legally allowing them to stay in business. Out in the dusty, sun-baked field, the veteran operators saw the writing on the wall. Grant Hollis, the seasoned regional manager who had quietly warned me about Veronica's intentions weeks earlier, walked into his local field office, set his hard hat firmly on his desk, and handed in his official letter of resignation. He was closely followed by 4 other highly experienced field supervisors. They were men who had spent 3 decades keeping the product safely in the ground, and they absolutely refused to carry the legal and moral liability for anomaly closure packages they knew were entirely fraudulent. The sudden, synchronized departure of the senior field leadership was the equivalent of a distress flare shot straight up into the dark sky. The aggressive industry trade publications and the financial press instantly caught the scent of the blood in the water. Headlines began to circulate, speculating about a catastrophic breakdown in safety culture at one of the largest midstream operators in the country. The federal regulators, reading the exact same headlines, abruptly changed their posture. The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration announced they were no longer just looking to fix 47 individual paperwork errors. They were officially preparing to vastly expand the scope of their audit, threatening to tear through the historical maintenance records of the entire 2,400-mile network. Cornered, bleeding cash, and facing an existential threat to their operating license, the Archer Meridian legal team launched a desperate, vicious counterattack. They submitted a preliminary defense brief to the federal agency, and they aimed the weapon directly at my back. In their heavily redacted, legally twisted submission, they subtly attempted to frame me as the architect of their current disaster. They claimed that I had maliciously engineered a toxic, bottlenecked safety system that was entirely dependent on my personal approval. They argued that I had aggressively hoarded technical authority to protect my own job security, and that my sudden, unexpected departure had simply caused an unfortunate administrative transition period. They were actively trying to convince the federal government that the person who had spent 16 years building the reinforced safety fence was actually the sole cause of the structural collapse. I sat at my kitchen table on the ranch, staring at a leaked copy of their preliminary brief. I felt a cold, sharp anger flare in my chest, but I pushed it down. I picked up my phone and called Nora Bell. Nora did not let me vent. She immediately went to work, helping me construct a heavily armored, impenetrable defense. "We do not argue with them," Nora instructed, her voice crackling over the speakerphone with absolute authority. "We do not use adjectives. We do not express outrage. We bury them in an avalanche of cold, hard chronology." For 3 straight days, we built a master timeline. It was a masterpiece of indisputable data. We logged the exact dates, hours, and minutes of every single anomaly I had flagged. We documented my exact role, citing the specific federal codes that mandated my actions. We cataloged every single email I had sent, warning the management team about the structural risks. Finally, we mapped out the precise digital footprint of every single closure package that had been wrongfully transferred out of my hands and signed by an unqualified analyst in the flow acceleration office. The document we created was devoid of any emotion, drama, or personal vindictiveness. It was simply a mirror reflecting their exact crimes back at them. The escalating crisis had now entirely transcended the realm of a simple human resources dispute or an internal corporate power struggle. It had mutated into a massive, high-stakes collision of fundamental forces. It was no longer just about who got to sit in the corner office. It was a brutal, public confrontation between the unbreakable laws of physical metallurgy the unforgiving weight of federal legal records, and the staggering, blinding arrogance of an executive board that genuinely believed they could command pressurized steel to simply remain silent. The federal regulatory agency did not summon us to a courtroom. They convened an official technical conference inside a massive, heavily soundproofed convention hall in downtown Dallas. The room was aggressively air-conditioned, smelling faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and burnt coffee. It was a space designed specifically for high-stakes, bloodless warfare. On one side of the vast, U-shaped mahogany table sat the entrenched legal defense team for Archer Meridian, flanked by their newly appointed compliance directors and a handful of very expensive, very nervous external consultants. On the opposite side sat the lead investigators from the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, their faces arranged into masks of absolute, unyielding stone. I sat at the witness table positioned directly in the center of the room. I was not there as a defendant, and I was certainly not there as a corporate representative. I had been formally subpoenaed by the federal government to serve as an expert technical witness. The federal inspectors knew perfectly well that I was the original architect of the highly complex risk assessment matrix that the current executive board had so recklessly dismantled. The proceedings began with a desperate, meticulously calculated presentation from the lead counsel for Archer Meridian. He stood up, buttoned his tailored suit jacket, and projected an aura of profound cooperative sincerity. He acknowledged that there had been minor administrative lapses during their recent departmental transition. He entirely avoided words like fraud or falsification. Instead, he proposed a strategic damage control plan, framing it as a highly proactive safety measure. We respectfully suggest a comprehensive, retroactive review of all anomaly closure packages filed within the last 12 months, the lawyer stated smoothly, gesturing toward a neatly bound stack of papers. Furthermore, out of an abundance of caution, we are prepared to immediately implement a localized 10% reduction in operating pressure across a select few segments. In exchange, we request that the agency allow the remainder of our primary delivery network to continue functioning without interruption, thereby protecting the national energy supply chain from unnecessary disruption. It was a beautifully constructed lie. 12 months of review would conveniently stop just short of the time frame when Veronica Hale began her aggressive campaign to wipe the dashboard clean. The proposed localized pressure drop was a purely cosmetic gesture designed to appease the regulators while keeping the vast majority of their highly lucrative crude oil flowing freely to the coast. The lead federal investigator, a gray-haired man who had spent 3 decades analyzing fractured steel, did not even look at the company lawyer. He turned his gaze directly to me. "Miss Howard," the investigator said, his voice echoing loudly through the microphone on his desk. As the engineer who originally designed the internal safety matrix for this specific network, what is your technical assessment of a 12-month review period? I leaned forward, pulling the microphone closer to my mouth. I did not look at the Archer Meridian executives glaring at me from across the room. I addressed the federal panel with absolute, clinical precision. 12 months is completely functionally useless, I stated clearly, letting the heavy words settle over the silent room. A 12-month look-back only captures the administrative cover-up. It does not capture the physical degradation of the steel. If you want to accurately assess the structural reality of this pipeline system, particularly the sections utilizing older, low-frequency electrical resistance welded seams, you must mandate a comprehensive review stretching back a minimum of 42 months. The lead counsel for my former employer immediately bristled, leaning into his own microphone. 42 months is an arbitrary and excessively punitive timeline designed solely to cripple our operational capacity. It is not arbitrary at all, I shot back, keeping my tone perfectly flat and stripped of any visible anger. It is entirely dictated by the unique physics of the infrastructure. The new analytics team treated every anomaly as an isolated static data point. They cleared holds based on a single variable. But physical pipelines do not operate in a static environment. You have areas in your network, specifically near the river crossings and the high-elevation pump stations, that experience massive, frequent fluctuations in pressure. I opened my notebook. Though I did not need to look at the pages, I knew the mechanical behavior by heart. When you have a minor mechanical dent located in close proximity to an active corrosion colony, and you subject that specific area to aggressive cyclical stress from constant pressure changes, those two distinct anomalies begin to actively interact. I explained to the federal panel, a dent that algorithms classify as safe will flex slightly every single time the pressure surges. That microscopic flexing systematically breaks down the surrounding metal matrix. It accelerates the corrosion process exponentially. Those interacting threats do not show up as an immediate failure on a digital dashboard. They stay hidden beneath the dirt, silently compounding over multiple operational cycles, until the exact moment the steel violently ruptures. You cannot evaluate that kind of progressive, interactive threat by looking at a single year of sanitized data. The Archer Meridian legal team realized they could not win a technical argument against the fundamental laws of metallurgy. They immediately shifted their strategy, aiming straight for my credibility. The lead counsel stood up again, his face flushed with manufactured, theatrical outrage. I must remind the regulatory panel of a highly relevant conflict of interest, the lawyer announced, his voice ringing with sharp accusation. Ms. Howard is no longer an impartial observer. Just days after her unfortunate departure from our company, she accepted a highly lucrative executive position with High Plains Transit, our most direct regional competitor. It is entirely obvious that her demand for an unprecedented 42-month operational shutdown is a calculated maneuver designed explicitly to damage Archer Meridian's market share and benefit her new employer. A tense, heavy murmur rippled through the back rows of the convention hall. It was a classic, aggressive courtroom tactic. If you cannot destroy the evidence, you attempt to destroy the witness. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor. I simply waited for the murmurs to die down completely. I looked the highly paid corporate lawyer directly in the eyes. Pressure does not care about the logo on the side of the company truck, I said. Every single syllable fell like a heavy iron weight onto the mahogany table. Metal only reacts to the truth. The room went dead silent. The undeniable gravity of that statement completely neutralized the legal theatrics. At the far end of the federal panel sat an independent metallurgical expert. He had been specifically contracted by the government agency to serve as an entirely neutral third-party evaluator. He had spent the entire morning quietly reviewing the 3 most critical anomaly closure packages I had explicitly flagged in my timeline defense. He slowly leaned forward and activated his microphone. I have reviewed the structural documentation for the 3 high-consequence areas in question, the independent expert stated, his voice dry and highly technical. I must concur entirely with Ms. Howard. The packages approved by the Archer Meridian analytical team over the past quarter demonstrate a profound, systemic failure to understand interacting pipeline threats. Approving these specific pipeline segments for maximum operating pressure without physical excavation data was not just negligent, it was technically indefensible. The entire atmosphere inside the massive convention hall instantly inverted. The Archer Meridian executives, who had walked into the room radiating corporate arrogance and legal invincibility, suddenly looked incredibly small. Their expensive suits could not protect them from the crushing reality of independent, verified engineering consensus. They had spent millions of dollars trying to legally outmaneuver the situation, only to find themselves cornered by the absolute truth. The federal regulatory panel did not issue a final, sweeping judgment right there on the spot. The bureaucratic gears of the government require formal written orders and extensive legal documentation. However, before the lead investigator formally adjourned the technical conference for the day, he issued a devastating preliminary directive. He ordered an immediate, mandatory emergency excavation of the 3 high-risk corridors we had spent the afternoon debating. He demanded that heavy equipment crews be mobilized by sunrise. As the chairs scraped against the carpet and the lawyers began frantically packing away their useless, sanitized documents, a profound, heavy understanding settled over everyone left in the room. The slick corporate presentations had entirely failed. The aggressive legal threats had evaporated into thin air. The final, indisputable answer regarding the fate of the Archer Meridian pipeline network was no longer going to come from a boardroom argument or a judge's gavel. It was going to come directly from the deep, dark dirt of the Texas plains. The heavy earth-moving machinery tore into the Texas dirt just past dawn. The federal inspectors stood quietly at the very edge of the massive, freshly dug trench, their hard hats gleaming brightly in the early morning sun. They watched with absolute, uncompromising focus as the specialized contract crews sandblasted the thick protective epoxy coating away from the steel surface of the pipeline. When the bare, raw metal was finally exposed to the daylight, the theoretical legal debates from the Dallas Convention Hall instantly evaporated into nothing. The first excavation site, located dangerously close to the highly sensitive river crossing, revealed a textbook nightmare. It was not a minor, mathematically acceptable anomaly. It was an active, aggressively expanding crack colony. The independent engineers climbed down into the trench and applied their ultrasonic calipers directly to the steel. Their readings confirmed that the structural integrity of the longitudinal seam was fundamentally compromised. If that specific segment of pipe had been subjected to the maximum operating pressure that the Flow Acceleration Office had recklessly authorized, the steel would have violently unzipped within a matter of weeks. The second location exposed a long section of massive metal loss, corroded far deeper and far more severely than the superficial monitor-only status the young corporate analysts had assigned it on their polished digital dashboards. The cold, hard dirt had finally spoken, and it completely vindicated every single hold I had ever placed on the system. The physical evidence proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I had never been an unreasonable delay. I was the absolute last line of defense standing between Archer Meridian and a catastrophic, irreversible environmental rupture. The federal response was absolute, immediate, and completely devastating. By noon the following day, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, acting in strict coordination with the state environmental agencies, issued a system-wide stop-flow mandate. They forcefully ordered a complete operational shutdown of the full pipeline system. The massive mainline pumps were powered down. The heavy iron valves were locked shut. The highly lucrative lifeblood of the Archer Meridian empire simply ceased to flow. The regulators legally mandated that the network would remain completely dead in the ground until the entire integrity management program was rebuilt from scratch and independently verified. The corporate fallout was a spectacular, brutally swift collapse. Veronica Hale was terminated just 2 hours after the federal shutdown order hit the boardroom table. There was no polite severance negotiation, no graceful transition period, and no quiet meeting in a glass room. She was immediately escorted out of the building by corporate security, her high-speed career in the energy sector permanently incinerated by her own blind arrogance. 3 weeks later, Chief Executive Officer Owen Mercer officially submitted his resignation to the furious board of directors. He attempted to frame his sudden departure as a mutual decision to pursue new opportunities, but the entire industry knew the exact truth. He was ousted for creating and actively protecting a toxic corporate culture that prioritized quarterly financial metrics over actual physical safety. The stock value of Archer Meridian entered a terrifying freefall. Without a functioning pipeline network to move their product, the massive coastal shippers immediately invoked the emergency penalty clauses buried in their contracts and aggressively moved their lucrative business directly to High Plains Transit. Furthermore, Archer Meridian was heavily penalized and placed under strict, independent federal oversight for multiple years, bleeding millions of dollars a day in lost revenue and mandatory consulting fees. Despite the massive financial destruction of my former employer, the most satisfying element of my vindication was not the plummeting stock price or the empty executive chairs. True satisfaction came from a profound, poetic irony. When the federal regulators published their final, unredacted public report detailing the gross negligence of the company, they explicitly cited the leaked internal communications. The entire industry, every single engineer, executive, and field hand from Texas to North Dakota, read the official document. They all learned that Veronica Hale had aggressively labeled my strict safety protocols as a bottleneck choking revenue. That exact arrogant corporate buzzword was legally transformed into the primary weapon used to completely destroy her professional reputation. I did not waste my time gloating over the smoldering ruins of my former company. At High Plains Transit, I was handed a massive budget and a clear, uncompromising mandate to build the most robust integrity assurance department in the country. I did exactly what Veronica had ironically claimed she wanted to do. But I did it the right way. I systematically designed a safety program that fundamentally refused to rely on a single human point of failure. I instituted multiple, redundant layers of independent technical approval. I implemented a strict, unbreakable rule regarding field data. No safety file could ever be condensed into a pretty, single-page executive summary. If a regional manager wanted to clear a pipeline for pressurized operation, they were legally required to look at the raw, dirty excavation photographs and the complete ultrasonic measurements. Most importantly, I completely restructured the hiring and training pipeline for the analytical department. Before any newly graduated data scientist or financial analyst was permitted to touch a digital dashboard or evaluate a risk algorithm, they were required to spend 3 full months working out in the field. They had to wear heavy steel-toed boots, stand in the blistering summer heat, and physically touch the cold metal in the trenches. They had to deeply understand that the numbers on their glowing screens represented highly volatile, real-world consequences. Several months after the dust had finally settled, I found myself standing in the lower pasture of my family ranch as the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the dry grass. My father and I were kneeling in the mud, tightening the heavy bolts on a brand new brass fitting we had just installed on the main agricultural irrigation line. We had spent the entire morning digging out the old, failing pipe. The previous owners of the ranch had attempted to patch a severe leak with cheap epoxy and thin layers of plastic tape. It was a superficial, cosmetic fix designed strictly to hide a fundamental structural flaw. We had completely cut out the rotten section, prepared the heavy threads, and installed a solid, pressure-rated joint. My father wiped the dark grease from his hands onto an old rag, stood up, and walked over to the main pump house. He grabbed the heavy iron lever and slowly opened the primary valve. I knelt by the new joint, watching closely as the heavy surge of well water hit the line. The pipe vibrated slightly under the sudden influx of high pressure, settling firmly into the dirt. I ran my bare hand over the cold metal and the freshly sealed threads. It was perfectly dry. There was no hiss of escaping air, no sudden spray of water, and no hidden weakness. The water flowed straight and steady, pushed relentlessly through a system that had been repaired correctly, with absolute honesty and hard work. I stood up, wiping the mud from my jeans, and looked out over the vast, open plains as the water successfully reached the far end of the pasture. I listened to the steady, comforting hum of the diesel pump, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace finally settle into my chest. I realized then that high-carbon steel is exactly like human beings and the massive corporations they build. Anything that is held together by a thin layer of glossy paint and a desperate lie will eventually shatter. It is only a matter of time. The only things that survive, the only things that can truly withstand the crushing, violent pressure when the real moment of truth finally arrives, are the things built right from the very core. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Where are you tuning in from to hear this journey? Please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts on corporate accountability and doing things the right way. If you enjoyed this video, do not forget to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so this story can reach even more people.